So Long has collided with tanker Stena Immaculate. Both vessels are abandoning.
Hello and welcome to The Nexus. This week we're looking at the collision in the North Sea. A Russian captain has been charged with gross negligence manslaughter after his ship smashed into a tanker carrying jet fuel for the US military. Was it an accident or something more sinister? We'll be asking our panel of maritime and military experts in just a moment.
Was it intentional? I don't think you can rule out anything at this time.
Given that Russia does have an active hybrid warfare program, I think people are wondering if we're being tested here.
But first, this quick reminder of what happened.
Breaking news out of the North Sea off the northeast coast of England. A massive rescue operation underway there after a collision between a US-flagged tanker and a Madeira-flagged cargo ship.
So Long has collided with tanker Stena Immaculate.
The collision of the Stena Immaculate and the So Long in the North Sea on March 11th may have been an unfortunate accident in a busy shipping lane. But there are just enough unanswered questions to keep both police investigators and conspiracy theorists interested.
A Russian national remains in UK police custody.
This is what we know. After leaving Grangemouth in the UK for Rotterdam, a route it often travelled, the Portuguese-flagged container ship So Long sailed into the side of the US-flagged Stena Immaculate just before 10 a.m, while it was at anchor 14 nautical miles off the coast of Britain. It was a foggy morning.
But questions are being asked why the So Long did not detect the anchored US ship.
These are big vessels that are hard to miss. The So Long is 140 metres long. The Stena Immaculate is 183 metres long. Modern technology such as the automatic identification system, which monitors all kinds of GPS information, should have been more than sufficient to warn both vessels that they were on a collision course. But there were no warnings from the So Long, which was travelling around 16 knots or 18 miles per hour when it ploughed into the Stena Immaculate. Crew aboard the Immaculate said it happened out of the blue.
The collision sparked explosions and fireballs. It was a low-speed crash with extraordinary impact.
Vessel Stena Immaculate is carrying Jet A1 fuel, which is on fire and in the water.
There were 220,000 barrels of that jet fuel on board. There have been concerns of an ecological catastrophe as a result, but
it looks as though the potential environmental disaster that the collision of these two vessels could have caused may well have been averted.
Neither ship sank, and so far scientists say there's little sign of dangerous pollution caused by the fuel and other chemicals that were aboard the vessels. And miraculously, only one person died, a Filipino crew member that had been working on the deck of the So Long during the crash. The safety of this Portuguese registered vessel has been questioned in the past.
Port Safety Control inspection documents from back in July show that Irish officials deemed the So Long's emergency steering position, communications and compass reading was not readable. That was among 10 deficiencies, they say, highlighted during the inspection of the vessel.
But speculation is rife because the jet fuel on the Stena Immaculate was being carried for the US military. It was part of a worldwide fleet which constantly keeps global US forces supplied and ready, while the So Long had a largely Russian crew and a captain from just outside St. Petersburg, an unfortunate coincidence in the current geopolitical climate. 59-year-old Captain Vladimir Motin has been charged with gross negligence manslaughter and remains in custody.
Mike Cain, the Transport Minister, stood up in Parliament in the UK and said that something must have gone terribly wrong for this crash to happen, but said that there was no evidence at the moment of any sort of foul play.
The Shadow Transport Minister, Jerome Mayhew, has today claimed that nationality does raise further questions about potential motivation, which the government do need to get to the bottom of.
Readings taken from the So Long show that not only were no warning signals sent, there was also no attempt to change course. The Stena Immaculate could not have moved because it was anchored, and it can take up to an hour to pull the anchor up.
Foul play has not been ruled out because it's such a strange accident to have happened.
Let's bring in our guest now, and today we're joined by Sal Mercoliano, a maritime historian and former merchant mariner. We also have Martin Boyers, the chief executive of the Port of Grimsby and an eyewitness to the incident. And finally, we have Andrew Tettenborn, a maritime law professor. Welcome to the programme, everyone. Sal, the report we just heard ending there with some speculation that foul play may have happened. What do you think is the most likely explanation?
When you deal with maritime incidents, it's usually one of two things. It's either a mechanical issue or a human issue. By all reports, Salong was operating normally. They were underway. They didn't experience any issues. That gives you a human issue. Question becomes, was this negligence? Was it indifference up on the bridge? Did we have an issue with the master was being distracted? Or was it intentional? I don't think you can rule out anything at this time. However, ships like the Salong, a very small coastal vessel, operates under a very rapid schedule, very small crew, and we have seen lots of incidences involving ships of this size just because of that velocity that they have to move cargo.
Martin, why was your port asked to get involved?
The collision was 10 nautical miles just off the coast of the Humber, and we're the first port on the Humber. So when it came to bringing casualties into port or getting them on land, the nearest port was Grimsby.
And what did you see there?
Well, we were put on standby by the Maritime Coast Guard Agency around about 11 a.m. And the first casualties arrived at 1 p.m. There was 13 casualties on a crew transfer vessel for the offshore wind farms that happened to be out there. And then each of the vessels that came in brought in a number of casualties, in total 36. And they were all taken off the vessel and put on into ambulances and taken to the local hospital. There was only one person that required assistance to do that, and then there was only, as it happened, there was one person detained in the hospital.
So Andrew Tettenborn, we have the manager of Stena Immaculate, Crowley, putting out a press release saying this wasn't a collision, this was an allision, if you like. Can you just tell us why they would try to portray it as an allision rather than a collision?
Well, what they're trying to say is that they were at anchor, and it's very difficult to see any way in which they were at fault. Now, we don't know the full facts, but I'm rather inclined to agree with them. If a small ship runs into a tanker at 16 knots, the tanker being anchored, it seems to me there's a fairly strong inference that it's probably the ship running at 16 knots which is at fault. I may be proved wrong, but we'll have to see.
Sal, is there anything that the crew of the Immaculate could have done to avoid this?
Yeah, we're waiting to hear testimony from the crew, get the vessel data recorder. I mean, really, the only thing they could have done is once Salong appeared on their radar and on their AIS system with a potential collision course was to use the radio, the VHF channel 16, hail the vessel, try to do it. It'd been very difficult to bring the engine up online on Stena Immaculate and to get the anchor up in the short period of time. They were trying to probably just alert them. Remember, there were 8 other vessels anchored in and around Stena Immaculate, so she wasn't out there by herself.
So the Solong's captain is, going to be put on trial, it seems. He's been charged with gross negligence manslaughter. But what about the rest of the crew? Would they not have been alerted by the radar and the other automatic safety mechanisms on board?
There is a potential. I mean, the ships have collision avoidance systems. However, any alarm, any system can be silenced. And we just don't know what the ship's master on Salong was doing at the time. Lots of masters who are up on the bridge having to stand watch will be doing other work. Could be paperwork, could be on the computer, on the phone. We just don't know. So there's plenty of systems that are involved. There's the AIS system, the automated information system, identification system that would alert them of ships in the anchorage. Again, this is just showing to be, in many cases, it looks like just poor seamanship and mismanagement on the part of Salong to steam into an area at 16 knots where there are anchored vessels.
If indeed it was on autopilot, isn't there an automatic braking system?
The system is designed to get you between navigation waypoints. So the ship would adjust for wind, current, and other factors. However, it cannot really slow down for the collision avoidance system. That's where the human element has to come in to be able to maneuver the vessel. And when we look at the track line of this vessel over the past year, we've seen it navigate around this area when there were ships at anchor. So you still need the human element. We haven't quite turned vessels into AI robots to be able to do that sort of maneuvering yet.
Yeah. Sal, I understand you're a bit concerned, or rather you have questions, about who told the Stena Immaculate to anchor there.
There is a designated anchorage off the Humber, and so the ship's anchored in this kind of overfill anchorage when the main anchorage is full. So the question is, Stena Immaculate, were they given specific latitude and longitude to anchor? Were they told just to grab a holding position off the coast? I think, again, there's very little that could have been done on the part of the ship or the vessel control to do something. However, if this was an anchorage that was being used on a common basis, it wasn't marked on a chart. And, if it was designated as such, then Salong may have, plotted a course around this anchorage.
Yeah. Martin, you're obviously looking after a great deal of the local fishing community there. The amount of pollution and environmental catastrophe, if you like, seems to be much smaller than was initially reported or anticipated. But what will be the impact on the local fishermen there?
There will be some impact, because they need to calculate to what extent the damage of pollution has occurred. And with it being a combination of oil from the vessel as well as the aviation fuel, there will be concerns as to what effect that is going to have on the vessel. And one of the things that is strange, and the other interviewers might have an opinion, is the manifesto. First of all, that they said there was some sodium cyanide on board the Solong, and then the next day it wasn't on the vessel. So again, who knows actually what has been leached into the sea and what will happen. In terms of the actual environment, there's a lot of sea life. The North Sea is a very healthy, active sea. There's plenty of fish there. There's a lot of shellfish. So people who gain their livelihood from fishing are concerned as to the impact of this sort of occasion. So there's still a lot of knowledge to be gained from what happened and what's happened with the environmental issue. I don't know to what extent the pollution is going to spread, but so far it has been contained. And at the moment, there has been no issue with fishing or shellfishing or any such other thing.
Andrew, obviously there's going to be a dispute between the two boat owners, the two ship owners, and also potentially from lawsuits from fishermen and others. How will this dispute be settled?
Well, that's a very good question. It could go to the Admiralty Court in England. It might very well actually be litigated stateside. The reason is a very technical legal one, that ships have a right to limit their liability, and it's much more easy stateside to get over the limit of liability than it is in Britain. Here, the limit of liability of the Salong is about $6.5 million, which may very well not cover all the damage it's caused. If it's litigated in the United States, there's actually a very good chance of breaking limitation, because all you've got to show effectively is that someone did something very stupid in head office. Breaking limitation, if you sue in England, or actually in almost any other country than the United States, is much more difficult. So my guess would be that we're going to see some US lawyers getting a chance to pay the school fees quite soon.
Sal, you've sailed on tankers like the Immaculate, that sort of size. They appear to have done a very brave and excellent job before abandoning ship of ensuring that the fire monitors were active, which provided boundary cooling water to the adjacent cargo tanks. And so only 17,000 barrels out of the 220,000 barrels of jet fuel were lost to the fire. Do you think they did perform very well under pressure?
Oh, I think the crew performed admirably. I mean, to be rammed early in the morning at 16 knots. Remember, they didn't know the extent of damage. We know now only one tank was ruptured. At that moment, they could not know exactly how many tanks were ruptured, if they were in a sinking condition, if the ship may founder. And more importantly, they had a fully involved jet fuel fire. And that type of heat is so extreme that there's very little that a 23-person crew can do. And matter of fact, if you look at the extent of the burn marks along the hull of the Stena Immaculate, that fire got all around the vessel. It burned both sides of the vessel, which would have meant that the ship's crew could have been trapped on board and not be able to launch their lifeboat. So I think they did the best thing they could. They set up the fire monitors. They did what they could to secure the vessel, and then they abandoned the vessel, leaving power on the ship. They didn't secure power so that those fire monitors could continue to provide protection, and more importantly, keep the inert gas atmosphere in the other tanks so that you couldn't get an explosion in the other tanks. It lowers the oxygen level in the tanks to prevent combustion.
So, Sal, just a final question then. What happens to this tanker now?
There's an assessment team from Smith-Bacalus on board, the salvage team. They're going to be doing an assessment for how best to salvage the vessel. There's be a question about whether they'll bring tankers out to offload part of the cargo, or else they'll be able to bring the ship into a port and offload it. Ship's going to require a dry docking because of the extent of damage. More than likely, we'll see this ship salvaged in some way or another, either repair where the ship was hit or potentially cut out the section and replace it. She's a fairly newer ship, so I think you'll see her eventually taking to the seas again. We've seen that with vessels like Ever Given and Dolly that were involved in major accidents.
Sal, stay with us a moment longer. Martin and Andrew, thank you very much for your contributions today. Much appreciated.
Thank you for having me.
Let's take a quick look at the ecological damage now, and it doesn't appear to be as bad as was first reported.
A Portuguese cargo ship carrying sodium cyanide hit a U.S. tanker loaded with military jet fuel.
Seeing the shocking images of the burning jet fuel on the ocean surface, the devastated boats containing all of those toxins, the aviation fuel, the potential heavy fuel from the boats, the sodium cyanide, all very toxic to marine wildlife.
It's early days yet, but it sounds like a pretty nasty cocktail of chemicals that could well be spilling into the waters.
Well, it turns out there was no sodium cyanide on board, which, as marine biologist Mark Hartle explains, was very fortunate.
That would have been a huge concern if that had entered the water, because of the reaction with water to create sodium cyanide gas, hydrogen cyanide gas, which of course would have been very, very toxic. In terms of risks to the local environment, much lower than we would have thought. The main concern we had was the fuel, but it's less of a concern than, say, if it had been bunker oil or crude oil. Most of it would have burnt off, and a lot of it's volatile anyway and would have evaporated. So any effect that we would have seen would have been acute, would have been at the time, at the moment of discharge. However, what has since transpired is that the Solange was carrying pre-production plastic pellets, so-called nurdles. They have spilled into the water and they are now washing up on the shore. Some of them have burnt and melted, so there's big clumps of those. And there is potential for organisms to ingest those, clog up their guts.
Let's take a look at the military aspect of this incident now. And the Stena Immaculate is part of America's so-called Tanker Security Program, or TSP, a fleet of about 10 US-flagged civilian tankers that ensure its armed forces have access to fuel during national emergencies or armed conflicts. The fuel on the Stena Immaculate was likely intended for one of the 13 bases the US Air Force has in the UK. Well, Sal Mercaliano is still with us, and David DeRoche is also here. He's a former official of the Department of Defense. Sal, you have some experience with the TSP, if you like. Just explain why it's so important.
This is a program started by the United States recently to flag 10 ships into the U.S. registry. The goal here is to get more ships available to the United States in times of emergency. And in the case of Stena Immaculate, the ship was operating under a 70-day contract for the government, the Defense Logistics Agency, to move jet fuel for the Defense Department.
David, there is obviously the Russian angle here. It's only an individual, but still, It's an odd time. It does raise some questions. What does the Department of Defense make of this incident?
Well, I think there's concern about it. We're looking at some of our vulnerabilities with supply lines and infrastructure. And given that Russia does have an active hybrid warfare program, there's been Russian attacks on undersea cables. There's been allegations that Russia, had a ship with a toxic container going into Trondheim in Norway that might have caused incidents. So there is, I think people are wondering if we're being tested here. But logistics usually is only dealt with in specialist circles. It takes something really big for it to rise to be a top of the agenda item in the department.
Yeah. And Sal, does this start to, raise questions about the vulnerability of these tankers, which are essentially unguarded?
I think it does. And I think, regardless of whether this is something that is, hatched by Russia or not, it raises that level of concern. We recently had an incident in the Arabian Sea where an American underway replenishment tanker ran aground. And for a short period of time, an American task force was without fuel. We had a collision involving the USS Truman, the aircraft carrier, in the Mediterranean. And now we have this. And while it's easy to make a supposition that this is maybe coordinated, if not, it is a good warning sign that may be demonstrating the vulnerabilities of our supply chain and why we need to perhaps make them much more resilient than they currently are in some cases.
David, going forward, do you think the Department of Defense will have to change how their tankers go around the world?
Well, it's a bigger issue than just tankers, but yeah, I agree with Sal. What's happened is over decades, we've been steadily eroding our sort of long-term behind the curtain capabilities and said, well, we can contract it out. And that's everything from Army mess halls to fuel support. And the problem is, when you contract stuff out, contractors are generally not going to be ready for you in times of crisis. And they're not going to be ready to take the risk that things do, particularly third country contractors. It's expensive. It's difficult because you have to make the case that basically you're going to spend more to deliver fuel to a place that, in the absence of any threat, it could be done much more cheaply and efficiently by foreign flagged, foreign manned commercial ships. But it's a vulnerability, and it's something that, if we've learned it from accidents, that's cheaper than learning it in a time of crisis.
Sal, I understand that a number of Russian vessels have also had problems recently, even sunk. Can you tell us about that and tell us if that is at all suspicious as well?
Yeah, we've seen a run of this. We had a batch in the Black Sea. A lot of that was due to the fact that the Russians were using vessels probably in an environment they weren't designed to do. Because of the fact that, they're in a situation with Russia and Ukraine with the conflict, that Russia is forced to rely more on their own vessels. However, the larger issue is we had a report recently from Ambry, a marine security firm, talking about the fact that there is a actor at place that are placing mines, limpet mines, on some of these vessels. Russian ships have been involved in the center of this shadow fleet trade, and so they have been targeted. And, the big fear that we're starting to see is that the freedom of the seas, which we have enjoyed since the end of World War II, may be more contested than we ever believe. And, with the creation of the shadow fleet or a parallel fleet, we may see some more divisions emerging on the world's oceans. We live in a world of just-in-time logistics where we can ship something tomorrow and get it kind of in our house the next day. But what we see is that works fine on the commercial world, but in military, it doesn't work very well. And the supply chain crisis of the 2020s really demonstrated that when all of a sudden COVID threw everything on its ears.
Oh, really? David, that's an interesting point about COVID. Apparently, it has degraded the quality of the captains and the crews.
I mean, there's a bigger philosophical issue here, which is, in the short term, it's always cheaper to contract out. It's very difficult. You're basically building redundant capability, hiring more expensive sailors, having higher standards of safety. You have to reinforce ships to have the machinery to transfer ship to ship that's not normally available on commercial ships. all of this is expensive, and it's hard to justify when, there's somebody who says, I can do this at half the price, with a Maltese flag tanker and an Indian crew. But we have to have the discussion about, if we want to have global reach and sustainment, you have to pay more to have that in waiting, and you'll have to pay more for decades to have it available in a moment of crisis. And that's an issue that I think we've kind of shied away from, and we've allowed the capacity to erode over a series of small incremental cost-saving measures that in the aggregate have really eroded Western defense.
David DeRoche and Sal Mercoliano, thank you both very much. Really appreciate your analysis. Thank you. And thank you at home and on your phones for watching. If you want to see this episode or any of our previous episodes, do go to our channel on YouTube. Just type in Nexus TRT World. Till next week then, goodbye.